It's Tuesday, the 29th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Ben Bradley, Plaid Cymru MP Liz Saville-Roberts, Alice Denby, who's Deputy Editor of CapX, and Observer columnist Sonia Soda. Today,
the sanctions that they will face will be massive. 10% will really hit them where it hurts.
But have new laws that aim to protect people from harmful online content been watered down? It's been labelled racist, sexist and ableist. Should this exhibition at a London museum be removed?
The Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
The judgment of the Supreme Court last week. But should the Scottish Parliament and other devolved administrations have the power to leave the United Kingdom?
Well, basically they're here and we're right there.
The big match. Will any love be lost as two parts of the Union prepare to do battle at the World Cup? More on that later, but let's start with China, because the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, used his address to the Lord Mayor's banquet last night to set out the government's approach on China. Let's have a listen.
China is conspicuously competing for global influence, using all the levers of state power. Now, in the face of these challenges, short-termism or wishful thinking will not suffice. It means standing up to our competitors, not with grand rhetoric, but with robust pragmatism.
Now, his speech comes at a time of huge anti-lockdown protests in China. You can see here in Beijing. We haven't seen the like of protests like this since Tiananmen Square in 1989. Now, there is some scepticism and criticism from Conservatives against any softening of the UK stance against China. The Prime Minister said the golden era of relations is over. But is robust pragmatism, my opening question to you all, the right approach, Ben?
Well, I don't think it was a softening. I think that statement you just made there, the golden era is over, says perhaps the opposite. I think the Prime Minister seems to be looking at China with some cynicism, as rightly so. They don't share our values in many ways, and we should be able to have we have to have a relationship. They're a huge player in the world, but we should be able and willing to stand up and have robust conversations with them about democracy, authoritarianism, and all sorts, state interference, all sorts of challenges that we need to...
Right, well, that hasn't stopped your colleague Ian Duncan-Smith accusing the Prime Minister of 1930-style appeasement. That's pretty hard-hitting. He's pretty clear where he stands on it.
Ian likes to be hard-hitting, doesn't he? I think, again, the Prime Minister's right to say you can't just go grand rhetoric on this. You have to be able to find pragmatic ways forward in those international relationships. It's all well and good saying we don't like people, but actually, as I say, they're a huge global player. We should approach all of those conversations with the right cynical attitude, with the right robust approach in terms of raising important global issues, human rights and others. But we can't just kind of shout things at them from afar and pretend that makes any difference.
Where are you, Liz? Because Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, was seen to have taken a more hardline stance in terms of the UK's response to China.
Well, I think we hear about the fire in Urumqi, and I mean, that is appalling, isn't it? But then again, at the same time, we're talking about values and authoritarianism, and we have the Tory government in the UK have brought in, effectively, means of stopping protest here as well with the Police Courts and Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. Oh. So there is a question to be had about how this actually is put into effect here in the United Kingdom. But at the same time, also, it's very interesting for the Prime Minister to be talking about pragmatic approaches, but we also know that his government has stepped in with the Newport wafer fab and the production of semiconductors. So we're going to step in with pragmatic approaches. You're then going to have to look at how is our industry, which is dependent on semiconductors, actually going to operate? How are they going to produce? And there was a piece by Carl Ennis, I think the CEO of Siemens, yesterday. I mean, Siemens are actually in the constituency next to mine. So it just brings it home to us. This isn't just an abstract concept. We need to have security of supply. It isn't just a matter of stopping China from operating in areas which are critical to us. How then are we going to make sure those supplies and those jobs are there?
Sonia, what do you make of that and Rishi Sunak's approach?
Well, I think robust pragmatism pragmatism. I mean, it's just words, isn't it? It's very interesting that he contrasted those words with rhetoric. It's rhetoric.
Well, you can be all things to all people, can't you?
Exactly. The real test is what do we do in reality when it comes to China? And I personally think we need to be taking a much tougher stance when it comes to human rights abuses, like the treatment of the Uyghurs and the curbing of protests in Hong Kong. Yeah. Well, then we need to sort of say, well, there will be consequences for the relationship with the UK, but you need to be credible when you say that. And I think the issue is at the moment is that I think Sunak is right to say in the long term we need to be more independent. The issue is, when you look at countries like Russia and China, we are a bit too economically dependent, and that's because successive governments, successive Conservative governments, have not taken the steps to make us more independent. And I think Brexit really interfered with that. As a matter of foreign policy, Boris Johnson pursuing a very hard Brexit that creates these huge economic blockages with our closest neighbour, that makes us more dependent on countries like Russia and China.
But as Liz was saying, what about when jobs are at risk? I mean, you heard from Lord Sassoon, who was on the airwaves yesterday, president of the China-British Business Council, said, we're talking about 130,000 jobs that depend on that trade with China.
But these are very... I mean, there's no consistency, isn't there? Because look at how many jobs will be lost as a result of Brexit. You need to take a decision as a country in this world with the way that global relations are going. Who do we want to be close to economically as well as diplomatically? And we have taken a decision, well, Boris Johnson has taken a decision, it's not something that people voted for, the sort of Brexit that he went to, where he's just driven a cart and horses through our trade relation. The changing trading relationship with Europe is going to make us much poorer as a country.
Right. Liz, did you want to come in?
But I mean, Ben just made the comment there about the referendum, but we've got to come back to exactly that point. What was the Brexit that was intended? It is the Tory government has decided that this is the nature of the trading relationship with us and our neighbours.
No one voted.
It makes us so much more dependent on other trade deals.
Let Ben in, and then I'll come to you, Alice.
We've discussed that question for 5 years or more and not managed to decide a perfect version of it, have we? We've got what we've got, and it's a process, and we have to build relationships.
Your government is in charge of this.
Your government
so we have to build a relationship, and Rishi's comments
Brexit.
here are important in that he also talks about relationships with our allies around the world, including Europe, including the States. And if we're going to have a robust approach to China that means something and does something, we have to have those positive relationships elsewhere and the security to be able to actually enact that. Otherwise, it's all bluster.
Has it, and does it focus minds, though, Alice, with Brexit, that perhaps relations with China are even more important?
I think if we are going to take this pragmatic approach to China, we've seen with Russia the dangers of having unreliable partners, but also the government, Boris Johnson to begin with, and subsequently have taken the public with them by saying if we are going to have these sanctions on Russia, if we're going to change our trading relationship, there are going to be consequences for British people. And if we're going to be distancing ourselves from China in this way, there are going to be serious consequences. We were talking about jobs. We are very dependent on them for trade. To get to net zero, they completely control the mining of rare earth metals, which are essential for green technology. So what does pragmatic robustness mean for British people? I think this is what Rishi Sunak needs to explain.
And no doubt questions will be asked over the coming months. I just want to update you on this story from my BBC colleague Ione Wells. She has tweeted the Chinese ambassador to the UK has been summoned to the Foreign Office today following the arrest of a BBC journalist. You may have seen the images of Chinese police beating the journalist Ed Lawrence in Shanghai and briefly arresting him while he was covering anti-government lockdown protests. We're going to move on and talk about the online safety bill. Let me show you this headline in the Sun newspaper on this story. Free speech win, it says. Tough online laws which threatened free speech scrapped by the government. This is the story that controversial measures which would have forced big technology platforms to take down legal but harmful material have been dropped. There was a huge amount of debate about it from the online safety bill. The Culture Secretary says nothing is being watered down, but critics of that section of the bill claimed it posed a risk to free speech. Let's talk to Zoe Kleiman, the BBC's technology editor. Give us the context and the background to this bill and why it's here.
This bill has been in the making for more than 4 years, and there are some people who just don't think it's ever going to become law because it's been back and forth and there have been so many revisions. At its heart, it's got really honourable intentions, and that is about protecting people in the UK, specifically young and vulnerable people, from seeing harmful content online, from facing abuse online. You know, there's nothing wrong with that as an aim. But the problem is, as soon as you start to sort of pick at it, whatever you come up with is having to walk this really narrow tightrope between protecting people and censoring speech. What we've seen over and over again is the social networks have not managed to regulate themselves, have they? You know, we see time and time again stories, tragic stories of people who have had their lives ruined by social media or have indeed ended their lives because of things they've seen on social media. Every time the companies say they're going to get better, they don't. The government's been saying, right, you know, you can't manage this yourself. We're going to bring in regulation now. There'll be huge fines if you don't comply, and these are the rules. But pinning down those rules is incredibly difficult.
What's happened to the bill? As I said at the beginning, certain clauses have been dropped, accusations of the bill being watered down. What does it look like now?
So they've brought in some new things, things like criminalising encouraging self-harm, criminalising sharing deepfake news. This is where somebody's face is realistically put on a digital image or video of, you know, an intimate image, if you like. That is all new. What's come out is this responsibility for the companies to remove legal but harmful content. And if you think about that, you know, how do you define that? That's a really difficult thing to define. And the onus is very much being put on the tech companies to do this. It's going to work by age verification. How is that going to happen in practice? Again, this is being thrown back to them. That's something that they have got to figure out how to do. Critics say there's so much been taken out of it now that it's watered down. Others say, well, actually, it's still got some really draconian powers. You know, that things like the government wants the right to see private messages between people. This is a huge debate about privacy and freedom of speech. But the fact is that there has also been a lot of tragedy, and a lot of people feel that this bill just isn't now going to do what it set out to do, which we need to remember is to protect children. Have a listen to this. This is Ian Russell, whose daughter Molly took her own life after seeing lots of suicide and self-harm content on social media back in 2014.
I don't see how you can see the removal of a whole clause as anything other than a watering down. And what is difficult to understand at this point is the balance between the new amendments and the clause that has been removed. The detail will come out. There's lots of secondary legislation that will need to be passed, and there's lots of work to be done in that respect. So it's very difficult to understand that balance now.
Ian Russell, father of Molly Russell. Thank you very much, Zoe Kleinman. Ben, do you think the balance is right?
I think it's a really complicated issue. I was one of those, I have to say, who has been really concerned about this issue of legal but harmful. I think who decides is the real answer to where you draw the line. We've seen this ridiculous circumstance until very recently where you've got the President of the United States who's not allowed on social media and the Russian ambassador is allowed on to spout whatever nonsense he wants to spout. That's a result of people's political opinion, not a result of a proper legal conversation about what is harmful or illegal. And that can't be right or allowed, that people in Silicon Valley can decide that. So I'm pleased that that concept has been dropped, but the real fine balance between that and safeguarding children, the story we just heard, is appalling. Wow. But things like that, for example, sharing videos that incite young people to commit suicide is already illegal. So that would come under that kind of illegal bit that they should take down.
Are you reassured, Liz? Will it protect children?
I think that we are moving in a direction which is the right direction to go. But I think it also, this is an immense complication for us as a society, and as legislators we try and walk a fine line between what is appropriate to legislate and what is free speech. There are certainly aspects of this to be welcome. I think the fact that there's an independent regulator, that's a major step forward.
And they'll have a capacity to issue fines, big fines.
And they'll have a capacity, indeed. There is also, we have to be very alert to the business models of social media per se. I mean, the algorithms and what is emphasised and what is brought forward and what isn't, that may actually be where the interesting interface between what is not illegal but what is harmful should be addressed. But I also think, I mean, one thing we could have also been talking about was Nazir Afzal's report on the London Fire Brigade and the use of platforms such as WhatsApp. Right. Now, that interface with the employer and really nasty stuff being shared amongst people where there is a duty of care for the employer and that's being used for the purposes of arranging work affairs, that is something I think we're going to see rolling out across all the blue light brigades and an awful lot of other organisations as well.
But do you think it does sound like it has been watered down because of pressure, political pressure, the sorts of pressure that Ben, rightly or wrongly, has been talking about, and it won't, in the end, be enough of a protection? And there was such an outcry at the time of Molly Russell taking her own life.
Well, I think if you zoom out, I think it's not so much a watering down as a pivoting. So a lot of the controversy about this bill has been around the free speech issue. Michelle Donnellan has been keen today to present this or take it back to the original purpose, which is about protecting children. The issue the tragic thing about this is that the death of one child is an awful thing to happen, but it's a rare thing to happen, and it's not a good basis on which to make legislation. And I listened to Ian Russell's incredibly moving interview on Today this morning, and while of course it's understandable he has these concerns, we need to be thinking not emotionally but rationally. And one of the things he was saying about legal but harmful was that he thought that some of the content that was most harmful for his daughter was drawings of sad girls that said alongside text saying, who would love a suicidal girl? I mean, this is horrible to hear, but it's difficult to see how something that was so specifically harmful to her, how you could legislate across the entire internet.
I suppose there'll be many people who'll say she was just one person, she did take her own life. But the algorithm issue, Sonia, this idea that you are then fed a diet, a daily diet of harmful content that may be legal, that is in fact what drives.
Yeah, I think that's really critical actually, because I think there's sort of these false perceptions that there's such a thing as a neutral space, and social media platforms aren't neutral. They pick what to push to people and they make money out of pushing stuff that's often harmful. So I think one good thing that the bill does is sort of take an approach which says that social media platforms have a responsibility to build themselves through design in a way that creates safer spaces, particularly for children. That's a good thing. I share some of the concerns that people have here about the offence that the original bill created, which was around harmful communications that sought to criminalise the sorts of communications that intentionally cause psychological distress. I mean, what does that mean?
For example?
Well, I mean, who knows? Who knows? And I have to say that the police have been terrible around policing free speech. The courts have ruled that our police have unlawfully interfered with people's free speech right in the debate about biological sex and gender identity. People have had knocks on the door from police officers threatening them and saying that they shouldn't be taking part in a legitimate political discussion. Their beliefs are protected under the Equality Act. Online, we have to avoid a situation where we basically get the police going around knocking on the doors of people who are saying things the police don't like, because that is anti-democratic.
Alice?
Well, I think we're talking about the power of Silicon Valley and who judges. I think one of the risks of this bill is that it actually empowers Silicon Valley. These, the big companies like Meta and Google are the ones who are going to have the money for compliance officers and lawyers to stick to all these rules. Smaller challengers and startups are not going to be able to come into a market and cope with the regulations like this. So I think there's a real risk that instead of that this ends up making Silicon Valley even more powerful. And I think you're absolutely right that we should be looking at this as a systems issue, not necessarily a content issue.
And I think the more specific you can get about, because nobody wants to live in I mean, there's no question social media platforms are not doing anywhere near enough to protect children. The more specific you can get about the harm, so for example, I think the new offence of making it a crime to push material that promotes self-harm is a good thing. But I would like to see it being more specific like that rather than creating a general offence around something as imprecise as psychological distress.
I mean, Liz, the Cabinet Minister, Kemi Badenoch, said we shouldn't be legislating for hurt feelings, which is how she described it when she was standing to be leader of the party.
Yes, I mean, it does depend then on who. If we take a step back and look at what is regarded as offensive speech, it does start from the point of view of the person who's on the receiving end. And we've all of us, I think, heard the argument that banter is justifiable and it's just people having fun, and we know that's not the case. And I think, I mean, just to come back to that report about the London Fire Brigade, this is a sensitive area, and there is a risk of us over-politicising.
But how do you legislate then for it?
When it's so subjective like that, and Kemi's right, you can't have a piece of legislation that's vague enough like that to be able to understand and police everybody's feelings on particular, because people react very differently. And the idea for my residents that the police would spend their time looking at that instead of somebody's nicked my car or broken into my house is unfathomable.
But nonetheless, we have the principle of that within the print media, and somehow or other we have to shift that from print media, which is fairly manageable because you can see the number of titles that we have compared to the plethora that we have online. But nonetheless, we are very aware that what is happening online now is affecting us as a society. So these debates are absolutely critical. As I said, the law will be forever playing a catch-up with this of necessity. But actually saying that it's just people's hurt feelings, well, no, it's not. When this is a motivation for people to pile in on somebody, it leads to tragic events in the case of, we heard about Molly Russell. It also leads to the attacks on some of us parliamentarians as well. You know, this isn't... Well, we can take it to two extremes.
I think what you can do is you can design platforms where, for example, pylons don't happen so much, because you can do that through design rather than taking down messages afterwards. And the whole point about bullying online and pylons, and, you know, I've been subject to them, is actually, you know, lots of individual messages that aren't very bad sort of start to add up into something that feels like bullying, and sometimes the people taking part in it don't even know that it feels like bullying. So these are really difficult issues, but I think you can put a duty, which is what this bill does, on providers to design their platforms so they don't encourage pylons, which is what they do at the moment. Twitter, for example, with quote tweeting, does encourage pylons. Why not just take that out?
Well, I mean, Nadine Dorries agrees with you that actually those sorts of pylons on female Tory MPs, she would have liked to have seen it strengthened and not, to use the phrase, watered down in this way. But your other Conservative colleague, Ben David Davis, has worries about freedom of speech that go beyond what has been put forward. He says the bill still has, or he has serious concerns about it, how it could undermine end-to-end encryption by permitting governments to order companies to access private messages. Do you have the same concern?
I do, and I think it's a really difficult balance, and we all want to have our privacy, and that's absolutely right. I don't want to imagine that they may do already. I don't want to feel like these tech companies have access and can see and access all of my messages and videos and photos, but at the same time, you know, we have got to keep people safe, and there are examples of where it's gone horribly wrong. So I don't know the answer, but it is a real concern that those kinds of companies would be able to just have everything and everything about us.
But they can, can't they?
Well,
and at the same time, they will not release to the police in cases of children who've committed suicide actually access into their iPads. Now that is power which is over and above the state government, which frankly is dangerous.
Let's talk about something else. I'll show you this BBC News headline. The Benin Bronzes. Nigeria hails great day as London Museum signs over looted objects. This is the story that the Horniman Museum in South East London is returning 72 items, some of which we can see here, including the so-called Benin Bronzes, to Nigerian ownership, making it the first in the UK to officially take such action on this scale. The artworks were forcibly removed in 1897 in a large-scale British military expedition. Do you welcome the decision, Ben?
No. I think on the returning of the bronzes, you know, there are global conversations, and if people are coming from other nations and saying we want those back, you can have a conversation. I'm not going to attack that particular decision.
What, like the decades-long one with Greece, for example, over the Parthenon sculptures?
In individual circumstances, right, you have those conversations. It's important you have a conversation. What I don't want to see, which is what appears to happen with the medicine...
well, we'll come on to that in a moment, but yeah.
Is this idea that we are, you know, trying to just say, right, Britain is bad, empire is bad, hide it all away, pretend it never happened. The fact that we're having this debate and the conversation off the back of those artefacts and that museum tells you that it's an important and healthy thing for it to be there, for us to talk about it and see it and teach people about it.
Yes.
Those bronzes came from Nigeria, and yet they're here. I mean,
we have on another
end of the scale, we have a golden cape that came from Malden, Wales, from a pre-Christian era, from a grave there, that's in the British Museum. Now, economically and culturally, that would make an awful lot of difference to North East Wales, yet it's stuck in the British Museum here. It actually is the question of, you know, who holds these items into the future? And this is exactly the debate that's going on with the bronzes. And the idea that it should be sat in some big ex-imperial structure in London with all its glory and that London should hold onto it forever, I think that is worth questioning.
But then that's the point I was making, right? So if there are people who are coming and saying, they're our artefacts, then let's have a conversation. But let's not concoct grievances for the whole museum
grievance, it was
curation.
stolen.
Well, if people aren't coming and saying we want them back, then let's not get into a place where we are artificially saying that we have this emotional kind of guilt problem for all of our museum curation around the country, and we should just start going through the list and closing things and handing them back. That would be really unhealthy.
Is it a guilt issue? I mean, Alice?
Okay, so two things. I think on the Medicine Man exhibition, I think it's quite extraordinary to find a museum sort of cancelling itself in this way. This is the Wellcome collection that's decided to close this exhibition that was devoted to its founder, Henry Wellcome, because, I mean, one of the things it said was the very fact that these objects have ended up in one place is somehow problematic. Now, that is an attack on the very concept of a museum. And where does it end? If you can't have some objects in one place...
Yeah, no, finish your point, because I'm going to just show, so the viewers can catch up with what we're talking about on the Wellcome Foundation. I think we can show you, again, a response from Melanie Phillips in The Times. You're absolutely right. The Wellcome Trust Museum is closing one of its main exhibitions. I think it's been there for about 15 years. Following concerns, it says, over racist, sexist and ableist theories and language. The controversial objects include a 1916 painting titled A Medical Missionary Attending to a Sick African, which depicts an African person kneeling in front of a white missionary. She has responded a little bit like you, saying the Wellcome Collection display erases knowledge. How can the Medical Research Trust continue to exist if it feels damned by its white benefactor? Sonia?
So I think on that one, I can't really understand why they're closing down the exhibition rather than putting the artefacts into context. I mean, I think there were, you know, there was lots that we need to learn as a country about colonialism and some of the racism that was contained within that. But the way to do that is to have that painting and to put it in context, so school kids going to see the museum today can understand that there were problematic ways in which people were portrayed and why that was wrong. I just don't see why you would do that. And to me, it speaks of a museum who's sort of trying to avoid some of these difficult conversations by just sort of saying, right, well, actually, this whole concept was a bit racist, so we're going to shut it down.
Trying to avoid a criticism that's doesn't exist. People coming out arbitrarily with, well, we're going to close this and we're going to send things back. Nobody had asked the question.
Well, on the sending things back, I mean, I think that's a very clear case. Those bronzes belong. Yeah, those bronzes belong to the people of Nigeria, and they should sit there, and Britain looted them. So, I agree with Liz that these are artefacts from history that belong to a different people. They don't belong to the British people.
But history is always contested, isn't it? I mean, as it happens, I do agree with you about the Benin bronzes. I think the analogy there is more clear with items looted by the Nazis. But then there are other people, so Professor Nigel Bigger, for example, who argues, well, actually, the Empire of Benin was involved in slavery. These were not completely innocent people. So, I mean, history is always contested. It's never black and white. And I think, and if you close things down or you take things away, then you deny people the opportunity to make up their own minds. It's extraordinary in the case of the Wellcome Foundation. This is a foundation devoted to scientific research.
It is.
It's extraordinary that they deny people and patronise people to the extent that they won't even allow them to see the objects and make up their own mind.
I would also beg the question, actually, is how much footfall is there in that museum? Actually, are there another set of reasons? But to take the step back to the fundamental question of here as to what do we show? Well, let's think about editorial policies of what lands in newspapers or what we're talking about today. That has changed over the decades. The same approach to museums, what is regarded generally as what a museum shows, has changed. Now, one because I'm particularly fond of it, is the Horniman Museum down in Forest Hill. Yeah. That's utterly changed from what they used to show in the 60s and the 70s and how it was originally set up, of course, as the Horniman tea family. They've interpreted that, and actually they've taken on the charge that, oh, you're only showing anthropological items from exotic and remote cultures. No, we're not. We're also showing really interesting stuff from European culture as well. And it makes you question what you're seeing.
Right.
That change is a natural development.
So I'm a bit cynical about this story because it feels to me like a museum creating a headline that they knew would be covered by every newspaper in order to get us talking about them. Because I just think they could have done this more subtly and more educationally and really provoked a very interesting debate by reframing the way that these exhibits were shown or changing what they did, but to sort of, you know, do a big, like, we're just taking all these artefacts down, we're not going to contextualise them because they're racist, ableist and sexist. It speaks to me of a museum that's chasing headlines.
Oh, well, Nick Merriman, director of the Horniman Museum, in the case of the Benin bronzes, says, I think we're seeing a tipping point around not just restitution and repatriation, but museums acknowledging their colonial history, and that's better history. Do you agree?
Arguing with that.
We're seeing a handful of woke nutters in charge of these
Woke
organisations.
nutters?
Well, I don't think that's
It's
fair.
ridiculous.
I don't think that's
this
fair,
idea
then.
that there's a tipping point in the country. There is a very vocal...
Well, isn't that what Liz was saying to some extent, that we've adapted and evolved in terms of our...
minority in the country of people who want to have this conversation. The vast majority of people out there think this is ridiculous. So this idea that there is a tipping point in discussion shows how London-centric and how very middle class we are in this conversation.
Well, except they've taken...
It's middle class to have conversations about history and colonialism. That's not
100%.
middle class.
But the idea that we should go back and say, well, these things are all very colonial and all very difficult, so we should take them away, we should not talk about them.
I
think
it's
it's
such a London conversation.
I think it's pretty dismal
Alison, I'll come back to you.
of the state of our culture that museums feel the need to apologise for their own existence.
Exactly.
I think that's I don't think it says anything good about the state of
I think we should have a discussion about whether we're apologising for some of the things that the British Empire did, and that is tied up
Was
with,
it your
with
fault?
museums.
Was it my fault? What we apologising
It happened. We need to talk about it.
We can talk about it, but then if you take all the museums away and all the artefacts away, what sparks that conversation?
But I think
Well, if you're going to call it woke, I think the chances are without the museums, that conversation isn't going to happen. So, I mean, the museums are leading
an
this
interesting
conversation.
example about how those particular objects are enlightening us about that particular incident in history. And I think that's the benefit of museums, isn't it? And the benefit of a material culture is that objects can give you a completely different perspective on historic events, and that's why we need museums, and we need museums to not be closing
It's about
themselves down.
contextualising it.
Well, on that, Sonia, if we go back to the Wellcome collection, taking down this exhibition, it says after replacing one object in 2019, the museum placed a sign saying we didn't feel we could provide sufficient context here to counter the risk of perpetuating the racial stereotypes and hierarchies it depicts.
I mean, that says to me we can't show things that used to be racist because there's no way that we can say that they were racist enough for people to see what society lived like. That just doesn't make sense to me. Of course you can contextualise.
But wasn't that the
things.
argument about statues that might have in some way glorified either colonial history or slavery?
I think statues are meant to glorify in a way that a museum doesn't. But I think these debates are much more nuanced than people looking for newspaper headlines on both sides of the debate would acknowledge.
Liz?
But it's interesting that I would wonder whether some of us would either want us to put these into context, and I do think that, say, that the debate over what happened to statues, the Corson statue in Bristol, some of us wouldn't want to, we're not supposed to talk about that at all. But that actually, now that we are, is a very healthy thing indeed. But that is not just limited to a few cultural items. That actually is a question that goes beyond. And I'm talking about us being London-centric. I could come back again to the Mould Gold Cape and the fact that for some reason or other,
debate on that
is
not
allowed to be in Wales.
I think it is cultural vandalism. You're going to go out, and that's literal vandalism, taking that statue down. Somebody should have been locked up for that. But at the same time, if you're going to go around all of our conversations and go, well, we need to judge each of our museums by modern standards and values, then everything will be shut. Everything.
Now, last week, the Supreme Court ruled, confirming that whilst many powers have been devolved to the UK's nations, the question of whether they should be in the UK has not. Let's take a look at this headline, an article written by our guest here, Liz Saville-Roberts, in the Sunday Times, the Wales edition. Mark Drakeford, must stand up to Sunak and Starmer's denial of democracy. Now, you wrote this article arguing that the United Kingdom is not based on consent. Membership is not voluntary. That was the message to the people of Scotland and Wales after Supreme Court ruling. Should devolved administrations have the right to leave the Union?
Well, it's not based on consent if the means to leave is not there, if the power to do so is not there. I was addressing that question fairly, for good reasons, to the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, because he effectively sits on the fence and says that, that this is based on consent. It's a joint sharing of partnership. Mm-hmm. It isn't, is it?
Well, Ben, is it or isn't it?
I think it is. We had a referendum. Scotland voted to stay. There you go, job done. I think in terms of, I mean, I'm not aware of any polls in Wales in particular ever requesting independence. It seems to me, I think YouGov consistently says kind of 1 in 4 people wants to have that conversation. So I don't think from a Welsh point of view there's any question about it. Clearly Scotland is much more contentious, but we have these conversations, we have these elections and decisions are taken.
Although even in Scotland, it's about a third of Scots who say they want a referendum next year. Just 7% of Scots put Scottish independence in their top 3 issues. So I think it's kind of anti-democratic for Sturgeon to want to impose another referendum when she said in 2014, this is I think it would be different if there was a clear Scottish thirst for a referendum, if there was a clear majority of the Scottish public who wanted a referendum and Westminster was saying no. That's a different situation. That is not what's happening. Is that Sturgeon is pursuing independence, and this referendum as a political distraction from the massive failings of the SNP in Scotland. You've got NHS waiting lists much higher in Scotland.
They're not here, so we can talk to Liz about Wales. But actually, the central question there being raised by Sonia is why? I mean, has there been a huge surge in people clamouring for an independence referendum?
In Wales, for example, we're looking at about, say, 30-35% support for independence when you take the don't knows out, which is very similar to what was in Scotland prior to the referendum there. And we are talking about independence here on a UK-wide programme, which also is very interesting. Now, for Scotland now, what Nicola Sturgeon was previously proposing, they went into the 2019 general election saying that if you vote for the SNP here, this is a vote in favour of holding another referendum. Both the unionist parties, Labour and Tory, said exactly the opposite. Vote for us and you're voting against the referendum. That returned 49 out of 59 MPs
But people
to Scotland.
do not vote on single issues. We know that. There are tons of other things that people vote on. And also you had Sturgeon say, we shouldn't be treating this election in and of itself like an independence referendum. So I think you've got to look at robust surveys of the Scottish public. If it was, 50 to 60% of Scottish people saying we want a referendum next year, I think that's very different. But it is a third of Scots.
Forgive me. This is exactly the same position as the people in Catalonia find themselves too. If you use democratic resources, you run into the wall. The wall that we've run into here is the clarity from the Supreme Court that the devolved governments do not have the power to ask this question. Well, if that is the case, if we have to come back to Westminster to ask for a permission for referendum, when you have, wait for it, out of 650, 533 English MPs, and then we are told that it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity.
But they did give that referendum,
They gave that
polling doesn't suggest that people want one.
Yeah, that once-in-a-generation. Now, what does that mean, then? Because that's what the one that's being thrown at us. Let us just make that comparison. The Good Friday Agreement, the border poll, that's written in once in a generation there. Well, it's not the phrase that is used, but it means every 7 years. 7 years is the gap that has to fall before another border poll can be held. The first piece of legislation that was Wales-specific, back in the end of the 19th century, was to do with a vote to be held in Wales on ceasing to be dry on Sundays. That had it written into it again, for some unknown reason, every 7 years.
Hang on, let me let the others...
We're 8 years gone since 2014.
Well, let me let the others in. I mean, who should have the power to decide? I mean, should it be devolved administrations? I mean, if they held a referendum and it didn't win in favour of independence, then that would be that. But should it be a reserved matter to Westminster?
I mean, Liz talks about consent, but Nicola Sturgeon just wants to keep asking the same question until she gets the right answer. That is not consent. And as for who should make this decision, the Supreme Court was very clear that this is a matter that affects the whole United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a family.
But why is it different from Northern Ireland? If 7 years is written into legislation there, why is it different to Scotland? Because we have this misaligned nature of the devolved settlement across the United Kingdom.
Does it not say you have to have at least 7 years in between? At least 7 years. It doesn't decree that you must have a vote every 7 years.
I don't think anyone voting in 2014 thought, oh, all right, well, we'll just have another go in 7 years. That was a decisive... And
of course, the argument was Brexit hadn't happened.
But as Sonia said, at general elections, people vote on many different issues. At a referendum like that, it was very clear. There was one issue on the paper, and independence lost. And I think you talk about the polls for independence in Wales. If you had a referendum, I'm pretty sure you'd lose there as well.
I think
But
it would be a really
surely
different situation if polls were showing a majority
Sure,
of
but
Welsh
why not
or
let them
Scottish
decide,
people.
Sonia? Why not let Wales decide?
Well, Wales perhaps, but Scotland, there was a referendum in 2014.
Fair enough.
It's incredibly disruptive to have referendums that dominate the political debate for more than a year, with a gap of 7 years or 10 years, say, and it's not what the Scottish people want.
That's the thing is, do we know that? I mean, if Wales and Scotland want disruption, if Wales and Scotland want to hold an expensive...
Brexit imposed.
Only 7% of Scots say independence is in their top
let me ask
priorities.
a different question, is in terms of it being a reserve power, what is the mechanism for Scotland and Wales to actually get a referendum?
Well, we govern by consent, don't we, at the end of the day? So I think it's absolutely right to say
there
that.
Isn't one.
But to say that if the polling was genuinely suggesting that it was something that was necessary and wanted, then
it.
Westminster wouldn't be able to say no. But it isn't, and particularly in Wales, I mean, it's less than 1 in 4 people.
OK, so you'll go for the
Wales.
polling, but you won't go for a referendum? Where's the rationale? That's not democratic.
There has to be a legitimate reason to
hold
have
a
one,
referendum
because
is
of
a huge
the cost, the disruption, the challenge of all of that.
OK, but then forgive me, I'm being devil's advocate, but I can't overemphasise this. Why is 7 years for one of the 4 constituent nations of the UK an already accepted legal interpretation?
Not an idea that you must have one every 7 years.
But
there
nonetheless, that figure is extant there. Whereas what we're told for Scotland is once in a generation without a definition of what a generation is. Now, it allows people like Nicola Sturgeon and me to say that these nations are being held against their will by the tyranny of the majority.
Are they, though? That's the question.
The courts have said...
I don't think people buy that.
No,
I just
the
don't.
courts have said that this is a national matter that must be decided by law in the UK in Westminster. So if you want to change it so that there is a different system, we need to have the debate in that place.
And we need to get the consent of
there's one thing we
533
can...
English MPs.
I mean, I do think the big difference...
Hang on. Sorry, I was going to say, go on, final thought before we move on to something that we all agree on, which is the importance of the football.
Excellent. Well, I was just going to say, I think in Catalonia, Madrid got itself into massive trouble because there was clearly a popular mandate for a referendum. And I don't think it would ever be credible. I think if there were a majority of people in Scotland who are saying in polls, we want a referendum, I think Westminster has to grant it. I would support that.
I think also you talk about who gets to decide. Well, in the Scottish referendum, Scots who lived in England had no say. English people had no say over the integrity of their own country. So I think this is rightly a matter for the whole of the United Kingdom as a family.
It's time to talk about football, my favourite subject at the
Will
moment.
we all agree?
For the first time, England and Wales.
Sure, we will.
England and Wales going head to head. Liz, feeling confident?
Oh, just come on. Come on. It's so good you're there. It's brilliant that you're there. We're so proud of you. Just do the best you can.
Well, let's have a look at the fans who've been gathering. They're certainly excited, as you would expect. Millions of football fans, look, showing off their musical talents. They're Welsh fans in the sunshine. Lucky old them. Obviously, millions of people will be tuning in this evening to see that big match. If England go through to the knockout stages and Wales don't, Liz, will you support England?
Oh, what a horrible question.
That's what I'm about. That's what this programme is about. Horrible questions. Come on. What's your answer?
For the here and now, Wales are going to go through. Wales are going to go through. And I am not going to jinx
That's
it
a
by
proper
implying-
politician's
I'm
answer.
not going to jinx it by
You're not
implying
going to
anything
jinx it.
else.
And what about you? If Wales got through and England didn't, would you support Wales, Ben?
I think Wales have to thrash England tonight, don't they? So I clearly don't want that to happen. But I'm disappointed, to be fair, not least because the England game on Friday was pants, so hopefully tonight is better.
Boring,
but I
yes.
really wanted Wales to go through, actually, and I'd hoped that they would have beaten Iran in the week, and this would have been a bit of a dead rubber, because I really wanted to see them do well.
England and Wales went. I think we could all get as a panel behind that, right?
I think
if they'd both gone through.
As a committed unionist, you've got to be backing Wales to win so we can both go through.
Oh, I see. All right, what about then predictions? Ben, would you like to give a prediction on the score tonight?
They're always
a realistic
trickier.
Prediction? Of course, Wales
These games,
can
Wales
go
and
for
Scotland
it.
games are always trickier, aren't they? I think we will struggle and win 1-0.
1-0. Liz?
2-1 to Wales.
2-1. That was confident. 2-1 to Wales. There's no real sweepstake or money involved in this, I'm afraid. But Alice?
Gosh, I'll just copy Ben because he probably seems to know.
Oh, don't copy Ben.
2-0 to
2-0.
England.
All right, you
And
can
I'm
up it then.
3-0 to England. Sorry, Liz.
3-0. We've upped it. I presume you'll all be watching anyway this evening on at 7 o'clock. That's England and Wales. Tomorrow, I'll be back, of course, at 11:15, and we will have Prime Minister's questions with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Please join me then. then at that slightly earlier time. And, of course, we'll be on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, on that note of consensus and agreement, at the end of the programme, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.